Hey, good evening, and welcome to the Comedy Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club for the month of April, because it's 420. And for the first time in a while, we're back live. So, well, you hear them, right? Like, it's pretty cool. We're back live. I'm pretty fucking excited. So here we are. It's the Comedy Experience Masterpiece Club, and this is truly a perfect example of why we have this club. It's the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers in Idiots Abroad, and we are very, very, very lucky to be joined here by Mr. Paul Mavrides.
Hello, everyone.
Paul, I'm really glad that you were able to take the time and talk to us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. So my first question is pretty much always the same question to everybody, because I love this question. Why comics? Of all the different things you could be doing, and you do it in a lot of different art forms, what is it about comics that attracts you, that excites you, that thrills you, that makes you want to bend over the table and and do that for 8 or 10 or 12 hours at a time?
Well, at the time I was doing them, it was the fact that it was an accessible medium that was cheap and affordable, and had no editors. Unlike a lot of other types of comics, the underground scene, creators are mostly left to their own to choose what they want to write, and the editing comes in where the publisher either says yes or no.
Right.
So, but otherwise, you're on your own creating your work.
Yeah.
Like a novelist deciding what they're going to write a novel or a short story about, and then they try to find the audience.
Right. So a novelist, once even if they find their audience, then it goes through a whole editing process.
Sure.
Right. But you can't really do that with comics because you have to redraw it then.
No. Rare instances, there's sometimes some emergency where something has to be changed. I don't think I've ever had to do that, but it's been known to happen. I don't know. It really is accessible. All you need is like a pencil and a piece of paper and an idea. You don't even need to know how to draw. All you need to do is know how to communicate with and have something to say or not say, depending on how clever you are.
Yeah. What were the first comics you remember reading?
Oh, the first comic book I ever bought, I think, was back in the mid 1950s, and it was that I actually picked out from a rack and went to a counter with a dime and put it down. It was A World's Finest.
Oh, wow.
And all I could remember from childhood was that it had a Batmobile on the cover, but I knew what year it was, so I tracked down the issue. I can't remember the number of it, but it was like, oh, sure enough. So, but I didn't get into collecting at that point. I think I was in the first grade.
Yeah.
Dimes weren't easy to come by in those for that age group back then. It wasn't. I didn't really get into it properly until 2 years later, when a neighbor of my parents we were staying at my grandparents' house. He was actually a neighbor of my grandfather. He's an old retired guy, and he had grandkids of his own in the 40s and 50s.
Wow.
2 boys. They'd come over and visit him, and he'd take them to the drugstore, and they'd come back with armloads of comic books, and they'd read them at Grandpa's and then leave them there. And it was just a friendly old guy, like kids, the way you're supposed to.
Yeah.
And we got to read his comic books, and there were ECs, and there were golden age things and all kinds of genres and crime comics and just anything you could think of. Just one knockout thing after another. And one day he just said, "You like them so much, here, they're yours." And he gave me like
Wow.
2 cartons of these
Wow.
things.
Wow.
Yeah. and that was all it took. I was sold.
What a great way to sort of get that whole breadth of material too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, nothing, there was Silver Age, beginning of Silver Age at that point, but nothing could touch those things.
Mm-hmm.
And whoever heard of them?
Yeah.
Not me,
Yeah.
certainly. I immediately ran into trouble with my dad, though, who was raised in an era where he was taught that any adult that read comic books was an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
So he was hostile to them, even though he had his own opportunity to become a comic book artist himself in high school, and he turned it down.
Yeah.
So all was well and good until a year or 2 later, when I came home from school ready to dive back into these books I had already read a million times.
Yeah.
And they were gone. And I went to my mother and said, "Where are my comic books?" And she said, "You never had any comic books."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a real way to create a fixation.
Yeah, they did. Basically, then and there, I swore that I was going to grow up and become a cartoonist just to get even.
Yeah.
And who knew? I did.
Yeah. Wow. So, were you making comics like, as a school child, or?
No, I was teaching myself how to draw by copying like newspaper comics that I liked, like Walt Kelly and Prince Valiant and the hard stuff. I mean, it's a bit more detailed than now and bigger. Not as big as they were back in physically in the 40s, but enough. And my father would give me tips on how to draw.
Okay.
So it wasn't all hostility.
Right.
They just wanted me to be a lawyer or a senator or something, and then I could be an artist as a well-rounded, high-ender.
Yeah.
But no, that didn't turn out either.
Yeah. So like, did you go to college? Did you? How did you start drawing them? I guess is where I want to get to.
Well, no, I didn't go to college.
Okay.
I thought I was going to go to college, but by the time I was 18 and graduated from high school, my father and I were at such political ends that we fought viciously for several years about literally anything you could think of. If I said nice blue sky today, no, it's not, or it would be in reverse, no matter who was saying what. But the upshot was, instead of getting to go on to university on my 18th birthday, I was taken out to a steak dinner, handed a $20 bill, and told to move out of the house that night.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah. Surprise.
Wow. So what did you do?
Slept in the park that night, and then went to a friend's house and covered my eyes and threw darts at a map of the United States to figure out where I was going to move to. And fortunately, threw a dart and it hit Boston instead of the middle of the Atlantic, which happened on my first 2 attempts. So I hitchhiked to Boston with $75 and got hired as a youth consultant to a marketing director and was given an office and a secretary, but nothing to do except tell the guy how lousy all his ideas were.
Wow.
and then I had to move back to Ohio to deal with draft, which I did.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the way, I just kept drawing and doing art. I had been drawing and since I was a kid, and it just kind of came natural to me. I'd already at that point been reading the underground, beginnings of underground comics in underground papers and all the alternative stuff that was developing. And like I said, it was accessible. Anybody could do it if you could figure out how to do it.
Sure.
And I was always my harshest critic. So when I didn't think I was good enough, I didn't try to like force my way in and get stuff printed. And started, learned along the way, worked for underground papers, learned about how to publish a paper and what went into that, and darkroom information, and just kept picking things up as I went along. And it wasn't till I knew I had to move here if I wanted to actually do comics, because to meet these people. Sure. Otherwise, I was in the middle of nowhere where hardly anybody even sold the stuff.
Right.
So I did that. I moved to Berkeley, started hanging out, meeting all the underground people and regular people too. I'm one of the rare underground guys that actually read mainstream comic books, and found some of them of interest. So eventually I hooked up with Jay Kinney, and we pitched a project to Rip Off Press for Cover Up Lowdown, series of cartoon panels, gags about actual conspiracies, with references and all that, and that came out and just kept doing them. Anarchy Comics that Jay edited followed, and eventually Gilbert asked me to help work on the Freak Brothers strip.
I want to go there, but let me back up just a little, because I really want to understand kind of how, like, this, if it was syndication or how, like, what was the network of alternative newspapers like back in those days? Certainly by the time I came along in doing comics, in the 80s, there was the Guardian, the Weekly, things like, it was fairly established, but it was also seemed like it was pretty rigid. Whereas back in those days, it kind of seemed like it was the Wild West to me. Is that accurate at all?
A little bit. I mean, again, it was like anybody could do it. If you had something to say, the means to turn it into something physical, a printed thing, wasn't that remote. There weren't Xerox machines yet, but there were mimeograph machines and other types of primitive technology where one could put together a zine, and in fact, that's how zines became birthed. So in high school, the kids would take journalism class and learn how to do a paper, and then we'd go off and start our own, underground high school newspaper with material the teachers wouldn't let us print.
Right.
So that was a curve, but still all disconnected. But even so, at that point, I was starting to see the work of people like Spain and in underground comics and all, like things like Yellow Dog and all the tabloids. And it was all hit or miss, depending, if you were a cartoonist in a city, you did cartoons for the paper in your city. But the only way people in other cities saw them was through a network of head shops that would carry these materials. So there was that cross traffic. And people would just borrow material from each other, but it wasn't organized. When I moved I moved from Boston back to Akron, and then after I had dealt with the draft, I desperately wanted to leave Akron again, because who wouldn't? And headed west and got as far as Tucson, Arizona, where I joined up with a community newspaper there called the New Times, which eventually grew into a horrible corporation that ate all the alternative newspapers in
right.
America and destroyed them. But at that time, it was an actual collective newspaper.
Yeah.
And about a year or two into that, there were probably at that point at least several hundred healthy underground newspapers
Yeah.
in the United States printing alternative, real news and alternative material at a starting to almost be a professional level.
Yeah.
But all disorganized, like I said, scattered everywhere. So a bunch of people decided to hold a convention in Boulder, Colorado in 1973, and it attracted, I think, about hundreds of people from different newspapers, all across the U.S. And plans were, now that everybody was meeting face to face, syndicates, were formed. Let's trade material and with each other and get this going. And one of the things that fed this was Ripoff Press at that point was publishing comics, but they had an issue. Gilbert was somebody who was a dedicated cartoonist and was thinking along lines of how do you make this work? How can people earn a living doing this with this weird material? And so Ripoff Press was in touch with a lot of the papers because they'd print the Freak Brothers for one thing.
Right.
And so I'm not sure who was behind it, but a scheme was created where Ripoff Press would have a syndicate that offered comic material on a weekly basis to underground newspaper and alternative clients.
Yeah.
And the cartoonists would be basically paid to produce something once a week. It gave them a short deadline. And they would produce work that could then be collected in a book and published and already paid for.
Yeah.
So so the books would actually come out on a schedule and everything, and it worked. So I Jay Kinney and I slipped ourselves into that stream.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise it was a whole different game. The underground press was laissez-faire to a large extent.
Sure.
Deadline, what's that?
Yeah.
You do your book, and when you get 32 pages, you bring it in.
Yeah.
And then the publisher decides whether they're going to print it. And if they do, they just print it.
Yeah.
And then say, okay, we got this. There's no advanced sales, there's no promotion, there's no nothing except the material to sell itself. That works a little bit. But if you want a real business that's not going to blow up in your face, you want something more stable.
Yeah,
and this was the way to do it.
Yeah.
One of the ways. It kind of came apart and it was abandoned too when the number of those papers began dropping and they became more. The alternative press supplanted the underground press, and then even the alternative press became more mainstream.
Yeah.
So they no longer wanted these, weird hippie, anarcho, anything goes stuff. So you had different features and comics that came up.
But it seemed to me like the Freaks was pretty popular.
They were extremely popular. Although I remember at one point, the politics were always evolving too. Yeah. So what was wild humor a year before might suddenly become unpalatable to people.
Sure.
Or at least some groups of people. And Gilbert did a long, not a graphic novel, but an extended story in one-page segments about the Freak brothers returning to their homes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in one week story, it was Fat Freddy returning to Cleveland, and before he gets back to his parents' house, he meets a teeny bopper, an underage teeny bopper, and she picks him up, takes him back home, and they take a bath together, and with the rest left to your imagination. But it turns out that she's his little sister, who's grown up since the time he remembers her being little when he was thrown out of the house. So, ha ha, but it outraged a lot of people, and in fact, the women and the paper I worked on killed the Freak brothers off,
right,
because of that. So Gilbert kind of backed away from that type of material after that, but and did other stuff that was probably better than staying in that direction would have led to.
Sure. So when he asked you to be an assistant on Freaks, what was this? This was like 77?
78.
Okay. What did that entail? What was the breakdown of work and how things flowed? And
the first couple of stories. Well, Gilbert's method of working wasn't. Almost nobody at Undergrounds worked like Marvel method or factory method, and people had a varying individual approach to their work. But Gilbert was always pretty loose about that. But the first couple of things he had me work on, I was being tried out. It was clear. So I was engaged to work on the art and fill stuff and do other characters in the story. Gilbert had written the whole thing by himself, done all the lettering, and it wasn't like ruling panel borders or anything. It was more, it really was drawing, but I wasn't really inking his drawings.
Right.
He'd indicate a doodle with a doodle, mostly, sometimes a little bit more detail, and enough to give me a direction.
Yeah.
And we'd be working side by side.
Right.
So if I had a question, I could just ask him.
Yeah.
Or pencil something and show him and go, how about this?
Yeah.
And it went back and forth, and I put in I worked extra hard, and he eventually began to entrust me to do more and more divided work.
Yeah.
But over all those years, the one thing that we kept Gilbert doing consistently was all the lettering, the word balloons and everything, because no matter what, people were, they wouldn't know why, but if it wasn't his handwriting, it didn't feel right.
I can see that.
They couldn't think about it, couldn't tell you what was bothering them, but it would be that. It didn't seem right.
Right.
Like it was really him if the lettering was different. So that was consistent.
Yeah.
And the other sop was in my direction was I do all the color if there was color.
Yeah.
So, but pretty much everything else was broken down, to where, we couldn't really sort out completely what each of us did.
Yeah. So you're pitching ideas just as much then.
Yeah, or kicking them around,
Yeah.
or having a starting point and riffing off of that. We shift gears depending on what was going on. Gilbert was living in San Francisco when I started working with him, but shortly after that, his wife Laura and Gilbert, they decided to move to Europe and moved to London at first. And Gilbert was supposed to like send stuff back and feed the production line, and but that didn't seem to be happening once he was gone. And then on a visit, he came back, and it was, I can't really totally remember how this happened step by step, but we decided to bring Dave Sheridan back in, and Gilbert was going to go back to Europe, this time moving from London to Barcelona. And our plan was Dave and I would do the art, and Gilbert would write the stories and letter them and send us the lettering back, and Dave and I would do the strips.
Right.
And that worked for a few single-page stories.
Yeah.
And then we didn't hear from him. And in a mercenary, self-serving moment of desperation, I thought, I'd like to go to Europe. I've never been to Europe. How can I go to Europe? And I said, I know. I'll go in and tell Fred, the president of Ripoff Press, that if they send me to Europe, I'll write stories with Gilbert and bring them back for me and Dave. And then I thought, wow, this is like absurd. I'll be thrown out of his office. So I went in the next day and pitched it anyway. And instead of being thrown out and said, what a scam artist, he said, when can you leave? And I was the delay. I didn't even have a passport. My scheme raced ahead of practicality. But soon I found myself in Barcelona, and for 6 weeks, and we wrote a pile of stories, and Gilbert lettered him, and I brought him back, and we were doing that very thing until Dave got sick. He had a backache, had it checked out, and it was endemic cancer. And he was gone shortly after that. Wow. He had apparently been sick for a while without even knowing it. So Gilbert and Laura kind of ditched Barcelona, came back, was still planning on returning to Europe, but had to tidy up affairs in San Francisco to do that. And before they left, we shifted over to, well, now what? We can't do our old plan. We need a new plan. What should we do? And Gilbert asked me what I like to draw. And I said, pretty much anything except the Freak Brothers spool table. I'm really tired of drawing their spool table. So let's get them out of the living room and see what happens, because they almost never go out except to score dope. Yeah. So we put them on planes, took them to the airport, and put them on planes without knowing what was going to happen to them. And at all. And that was the beginning of this book.
Yeah. And it started print in Ripoff Comics.
Yeah, it was our plan was going to be initially to serialize it in Ripoff Comics. It was coming out as a regular comic periodical at that point.
Probably 4 times a year or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But I forget the reason. It wasn't working out. But it still produced like the first issues worth of pages to put out. And then we just shifted over to just working on the story proper. And I found myself returning to Europe every 1.5 to 2 years, and for a period of at least a couple of months, where I'd stay with Gilbert, and we would work intensely on.
Ripoff Comics was magazine format. and
Right.
not comic book
Right.
format. Did that change how you guys thought about the page, or thought about the construction of the story, or did you see what I mean? Like, just the extra space.
No.
Yeah.
We just dropped it into that
Yeah.
that space
Yeah.
and made bigger or smaller margin.
Yeah.
Because the end point we was always going to be the comic book.
Yeah.
And this long story.
Yeah.
You know, we knew it was going to be 3 issues long. So we felt safe just rolling dice with our eyes shut for the first issue. Because we could set up enough, a juggling act by just throwing a bunch of stuff in the air and
Sure.
then giving us time to figure out how to turn it into a pattern as it came down.
But it gets denser and denser and denser as the story goes along.
Yeah. We developed it. We weren't just like, surfing the top level of it. And it became pretty clear to us after halfway through what we were doing and where it was going.
Right.
So it was a lot of fun doing this stuff. And the time spent sitting side by side working would get us to the point where I'd feel comfortable about like going back halfway around the world to like finish off pages and things.
Right.
And my approach to the material right from the start was to avoid it looking like a jam, like you'd see in those Zap Comics jams where everybody's just working out in their own style. I was a Freak Brother fan before I was a creator of them, a creator working on them. So I tried to do what I wanted to read, which was a seamless Freak Brothers story. It wasn't going to look exactly like Gilbert working on his own, because nobody can really counterfeit him or the way he thinks. But I tried to merge what I was doing and adopt to him. So it would still be my work, but in the end, it would be a seamless story visually.
Yeah.
With its own kind of crossbred style.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want people thinking about who drew what.
Sure.
We wanted them to just read the story and enjoy it and laugh at the jokes.
Between the two of you, who has the bigger Kurtzman influence, you think?
Oh.
Just because I feel a lot of Kurtzman in this in a lot of ways,
I think we were both. I was influenced more and more by Kurtzman as I went along, and really began appreciating his simplest stuff, which turned out to always be labored over at a surprising level. Gilbert was, I can only guess at Kurtzman's influence on him, since he actually worked under Kurtzman on projects. Yeah, I think.
Okay.
I mean, not doing things directly with him, but for like the magazines he was.
They have pieces that they work on.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
Well, there you go. But I came to really just be totally impressed. I was lucky enough in the earlier mid-1990s to be visiting Kevin Eastman in Northampton, Massachusetts, and Dennis Kitchen had moved there and had a really nice setup there. This was Tundra was still a concern and all that, right. I think, but Dennis had started agenting, and I was there. He had Harvey had just died, and his widow had sent all of Harvey's archives,
Wow.
comic archives onto Dennis
Mm-hmm.
to sort out and see what was what.
Right.
And I was there the night Dennis opened them up, and they were like wooden crates, the size bigger than a fridge, like a restaurant freezer would be in, except they were full of artwork.
Uh-huh.
And that's where we were both just agog going through this stuff, because he collected everything and kept it. There were not just the story or with like the printed version and all that, but the initial idea on a lunch napkin that went to a little bit of more doodles, and then sketch like everything in order. You know, it didn't have to be any sorting.
Yeah.
And not just his work. He went around the EC offices, grabbing everything everybody else was discarding, going through their wastebaskets, like smoothing drawings out and roughs and tracings, and keeping those in order. Yeah, it was awesome. And, you know, but seeing that kind of thing, you know, with you got to actually, I got to see how these things were developed by the artists, and you know, step by step. It was incredible, and that just left me going, wow, Harvey Kurtzman, yeah.
Cool.
But you know, it's kind of like Art Spiegelman. You know, you see their work, and it's deceptively simple, but they've labored and thought about every casual line in it, which isn't casual at all.
I've always thought of Kurtzman as a very detailed artist when I think about it, because
even the
I look
simple
at those old
stuff,
ads, and you know, just those like starchy or whatever, you know, some parody of some. It's just a knockoff bullshit. It's even, you know, but it's so labored over and so detailed, and you can see it, and it's incredible. And so this book in particular, like, really makes me think a lot of those old Mads. You know,
well, we put a lot of eye candy and mental candy in there too. That was one thing. We intentionally made these things, and I followed Gilbert's cue, to have a long shelf life, which is why 13 issues of the Freak Brothers in a career.
Right.
You know, like a laughably small number compared to most titles. But they print over and over and over, you know, and they also were designed to translate easy. So we stayed away from jokes about real people or politicians or things that could lock them into a space. The city they lived in looked kind of like San Francisco, that might be in any country on the earth, just about. So that anybody in those places would think the Freak Brothers are living down the street from where they are. We stuck to humor that you know was could be translated. And if it couldn't directly be translated, we made extra effort to make sure that there was some kind of reference in the country it was going to go to that was the equivalent of what we had, so that conceptually everything would still work. So I can't say we overthought it, because that's a danger too. You'll dry something out if you do that. But we kept that in as a consideration. We wanted them to feel universal. And Gilbert, from the start, you know, wanted to do a comic strip, so he designed these not a strip, but a continuing uh, property. So he modeled them kind of after not by personality, but by the structure, like of comedy trios, the Three Stooges or the Marx Brothers, or in French comics it would be La Petite Nicolettes, I think, which was a comic strip about three hobos,
Okay.
French hobos. So that it was like I said, a juggling act where you could have all these different interactions because you were moving three things around in different combinations.
Yeah, and it also really works as a sort of iconic comic strip in that each of them has a very distinct silhouette. It's very clear who the characters are at all times. You're never going to be confused between them and anyone else.
Yeah,
that's a talent that I don't think that a lot of people necessarily recognize they need to do right away.
Well, no, I mean, Gilbert's characters were always weird though and stood out, and I even encountered him long before I was seeing him in any underground anything where his stuff from that he was doing back in Austin was showing up in drag cartoons, and then the follow-up Wonder Warthog magazine, a 2-issue run, which I encountered, being taken on shopping trips to the grocery store with my mother. It was these things were on the magazine rack at the supermarket, not at some comic book shop. There were none. They were probably at newsstands too, but Mom didn't take me to the newsstand. So, he stood out. He stood out. It was just like weird shit, and it was really funny, and, and outrageous.
So what's your process? Let's stick with Idiots Abroad.
Okay.
Maybe. What was your process when you started the story? I mean, since you didn't map it all out, I'm assuming that you didn't start with a script. That you're starting. What are you doing? Thumbnails and showing them to one another, and trying to picture how the breakdown works.
Well, we don't work like other cartoonists.
Sure. That's what I'm asking. And that's what I love about
the genesis of this thing. Show them the first front page of the actual. Here's the Freak Brothers standing under a passenger jet wing on a runway hitchhiking, and we had a rough doodle of that thing on the page, the comic page, and I was sitting there staring at it and went, I can't really draw an accurate jet plane without kind of mentally, memorizing or referencing an actual one. I could draw something that looks kind of like one, but it wouldn't really be right. And we sometimes tried to make things seem real to anchor the more ridiculous things we put in between, layer them with. So I said, I need to see some jets and stuff, and know what the airport looks like and all that, because I've been through them, but I wasn't thinking about drawing them when I was there. Sure. So I was thinking about catching a jet or getting a drink or looking for luggage.
Sure. And it's very different today because you could just Google these things.
Right. Right. It's
every reference you ever needed.
But I mean, back then you had to build up, piles of magazines and National Geographics and God knows what, and file cabinets worth of it, just in case. But here, we're sitting there, and we're in our studio. Rip-Off Press is basically down to two resident cartoonists, me and him, and we've got our studio clubhouse where the sign, the that's put on the doors, like cartoonists that work, don't disturb. And people that worked at Rip Off Press would not disturb us when that sign was up. They might have if they had known what we were doing behind there. In this instance, Gilbert said, well, let's go to the airport. And I went, great. So I found myself, we spent the next 3 days out at SFO, just wandering around, soaking up the ambiance. Yeah. Gilbert wouldn't let me draw anything or take photos. He just wanted us to feel like the airport. and so we did that, and we ate lunch out there. We got stoned in the parking lot. We'd go back into the airport and stare at the jets, and we returned to the office, and neither of us could still draw a fucking plane. So then we spent days going to every model shop in the Bay Area and buying armloads of plastic model kits of all kinds of airplanes and boats and whatever struck our fancy. And then, like a couple of 10-year-olds, we sat up in the office getting stoned and putting these models together instead of doing anything to advance the strip. And the president of the company, was like, what? We're doing research. So when we couldn't go any further and we ran out of excuses, we finally started drawing. And but at that point we had a basic idea. What we had actually been doing all that time was thinking about the story.
Sure.
While we were building the models and just hanging out. So in a way, we actually were working and began advancing the story. We had the jets down, we had the airport down, we put them on planes.
Yeah.
We didn't have to look up the destination. Once we one's going to South America. We're going to find something in South America we want to draw, or this or that, and then the next step entered in.
So if you're not writing out a script, then
we kind of had these loose things. I'm not sure I could even call them a script sometimes, but they were notes,
right?
That kind of slowly coalesced into a page. When it came time to actually put something down on the page. And Gilbert would tweak dialogue and things if it was if he had something in mind, or to make it fit more into what his idea of how one of the Freak Brothers would say something.
Sure.
It might be the same sentiment that we wrote or agreed on, but he'd finalize that and had the last word because he was lettering it. And I didn't have any problem with that. Because working with him is a learning experience even now. Although we haven't directly worked in a room together quite some time.
Right.
The last story we did together was in 2014, and we were separated by a continent or in an ocean. So.
Did you talk on the phone or something?
On that one, no. And on working on the Idiots Abroad, rarely, which is why I simply because I think the phone rates were ferocious back then, and all the more so between France and Europe, where the dollar was heavily devalued in the 1980s. So if you called the United States from Paris, you had to sit there at Gilbert's house. You used a stopwatch because you were being charged every 5 seconds. So
Yeah.
timing, you weren't just like, oh, well, what do you want to talk about? I don't know. See any TV?
Yeah.
And look, a $300 phone call discussing TV.
Yeah. I'm just trying to really wrap my head around how you guys work together, especially when the lettering was done before the final art, right?
Well, in that case, it was done on the page.
Yeah.
In the case of where the stories that Dave and I would do,
Yeah.
they were cut out, and we had to figure out the balloons and glue
Mhm,
them
mhm,
down.
mhm, mhm.
But it worked. People to this day think Gilbert drew all on these things that Dave and I did.
Yeah.
So, so it turned out we were right about taking cues from the handwriting.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, it's you don't run into that on mainstream books because
not usually.
professional letterers are now programs are
Yeah.
doing the lettering.
Yeah. Well, and they're all separate layers of the art anyway.
Yeah.
These days, yeah. I prefer hand lettering though. I mean, there's something about hand lettering that's special. I think.
It's warmer,
It is.
less cold.
Yeah. And integrated with the art too, and particularly you start getting special effects and things like that. And there's a lot of really funny, just little background noises and stuff that happen in the art in Freak Brothers. That's just hell of entertaining, I think. Let me see. Does anybody here have any questions before I? Who else has a question? Please ask.
Well, one thing I didn't get is why are they going to Columbia to get news? They Columbia
Because that was too easy, and they're the Freak Brothers. Who knew that they had money for plane tickets? That must have been the rent money.
I was kind of wondering when they got to Columbia, how they were going to buy the weeds since they'd spent all the money.
They're not forward thinkers. They kind of operate the way we do when it comes to writing a story. Well, if Columbia has bunches of weed, we'll just find some and we're there. Which kind of worked for me wherever I went. There was always marijuana without me having to look for it.
Do you think that was because you worked on the Freak Brothers, or despite of it?
Sometimes both.
Yeah.
At the same time, sometimes. Oh, one time.
So, what do you hope people walk away with after reading Freak Brothers?
Any of the Freak Brothers?
Yeah.
Oh, a good laugh. Maybe some insight. Not as much as they once might have held, because the characters we're describing and the times really have shifted a bit. But still, some of the reactions are universal and carry from generation to generation, and certainly more so among, say, marijuana smokers, no matter what era they're from. You could go back in time and see that that's so. It's a distinct culture and mindset. No matter how much commercialization tries to be layered on it, it always comes down to an individual's brain being having its chemistry messed with.
What if let's narrow his question a little more. What would you like people to take away from Idiots Abroad? Is that different than the strip itself?
Well, an entertaining read, an adventure story, a cautionary tale not to act like these guys. Not that you could. You'd probably die or be in prison quickly.
Right.
Uh,
There's a lot of kind of heavy political stuff
Yeah.
in here. Stuff about religion that it gets touched on in other Freak Brother stories. But this is, I don't know, this is kind of a special opus to me.
Well, I mean, I had an influence on it, so
Yeah.
I guess some of that psychology comes from me.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm not sure if I stop at what kind of comic do I like to read. It's a hard one for me to answer because I have fairly eclectic tastes, and over time I've realized that sometimes the things I used to hate I love the most, and vice versa, as my own attention shifts and changes.
Yeah.
So,
But I think there's some real cultural critique in here, and
yeah,
think,
we put that in.
You know,
I mean, we were dealing with subjects that, we used MacGuffins that had political weight. And a MacGuffin is a device that drives a story forward, but isn't necessarily anything a reader or a viewer cares about. It's a story device, and here, there's a nuclear bomb hidden in a soccer ball. Spoiler alert for the 30-year-old book. And so on. And sometimes, the initial joke that's mildly in one direction leads you deeper and deeper into that area. If one guy gets rich and starts a religious cult, then, that it's easy to think of, and then he enslaves his old friends,
right?
Literally, or this or that. And it's also, manipulating the characters and pushing them. And I mean, one of the things almost any cartoonist does is create a character and then torment them.
Yeah. Sure.
No matter whether you love the character or hate them, you put them through the paces and do things to them that you wouldn't do to your friends, mostly. So, and the end point is to still entertain people.
Sure.
And in a way that, and we wanted to give them a story that they'd read more than once.
Yeah.
Not just a bowl of popcorn. They're like,
So let's talk about something like, say, Phineas founding the religion, enslaving his friends. At what point did you come up with that? Because that's kind of the denouement of the story in a way.
Well, it was a good way to, they were all off on their own paths that had to slowly come together and intertwine, which was deliberate on our part. We kicked them over the cliff randomly, but after they were falling, we decided to start steering them towards definitive X's below, so that they'd hit exactly the way we want them to, even though we didn't know where they were going at first. With the church, well, at that point, I had already become deeply involved in another one of my day jobs, Church of the Subgenius,
Right.
and had quickly recruited almost all the cartoonists and people I knew who didn't resist one bit, which is the sign of a good cult. You don't have to hold people captive. They willingly fall into your trap. And Gilbert was among those because how could he resist? We even grabbed Crumb. But, Gilbert couldn't put Church of the Subgenius in our story.
Sure.
So he kind of like, initiated this strain of fundaligionism and, but informed with the same type of cynical attitude that the other train was using. And only, this one was suited to our needs in doing this book.
Yeah.
The subgenius stuff is open-ended and
Sure.
doesn't require a denouement.
It was 5-6 years altogether that
Yeah.
these 3 issues came out.
Yeah,
That's a long time to be telling a single story
yeah, it is.
that you're not sure where it's going necessarily. At
And
first.
we were doing all these other things in
Yeah.
between all that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like we were working on it the solid
Sure.
6 years. It kind of helped. You know, you don't. There was a certain pressure. It wasn't like the old days.
Yeah.
You know, Rip-Off Press was dependent upon this stuff, and we really, you know, our promise to the readers was we'll actually tell you how it ends.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to. But even so, we're you know. It was hard work, and sometimes it really was like round the clock, you know, on certain aspects of it, especially in when the black and white was all done and it came time to do the color. The first 2 issues, 7 and 8, the first 2 parts of the story were done. The color was produced by me doing detailed color roughs on vellum in Prismacolor, and then as guides for a cartoonist in his own right, an excellent artist, Guy Colwell, who had mastered the art of painted grayscale color separations. So he would translate the color roughs into 4 paintings that he'd make. It was fast too, faster than me, and he was really accurate. He'd capture, you know, the proofs in the book. He'd capture all these colors and details that I was feeding him. Yeah. And then when it came time for the 3rd chapter, Guy went on a peace march for months. And he wasn't there. And I sure couldn't knock out these. I mean, I could,
right,
but it would take me months to come up to that speed, you know, for doing this really abstract thinking. You're looking at a color and deciding the 3 different gray tones that would turn into color further on down the line. And that requires you don't get that without experience. So instead I had to I took acetate and did full color gouache paintings of each page, which were then to match the type of color Guy had already done.
Right.
And that was like a solid month of 12-hour days with no days off.
Wow.
To do 30 pages of that. It might have taken a bit longer.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, you can see the difference between the first 2 parts and the 3rd part. It's richer, kind of.
Yeah, well, there's one less step in translation. So
I wonder about like pages, for example, like these. Where...
This Gilbert was just trying to see how many words he could fit on a page. Seriously.
Yeah.
And that was like almost 700 words on this page.
Yeah. This is kind of insane.
Why?
Yeah,
just because.
To make the drawing faster?
No. Yeah. No, I mean, it would make the drawing faster because you can see here's panels where the characters are like 1/8 of an inch tall, and 65% of the panel is dialogue.
But
they're
there's
like,
still so many changes and so many things in each.
oh,
I think it took
it's
as long to draw, if
yeah,
not longer.
yeah, it's like a couple of.
Because you have to put visual information in among these
Well, here's where
hundreds of words.
I'm always tripped up by our guarantee to have a crowd scene in every panel. But I think in this place, it really did serve a background way of emphasizing what was going on here.
Right.
This is because this is representing a speed education given to two of the Freak brothers by the third.
Yeah.
Where lots of information is pounded into their heads.
Yeah.
So the dense panel is reminiscent of that, even though it wasn't directly like planned that way.
I love the fact that it was just an experiment to see how many words you could fit in.
Well, even I was going, Gilbert, what in the hell are you doing here? And he said, well, I just wanted,
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, and then like color-wise, pages like this one I really love. Just the psychedelic, flying in the plane.
Yeah, that's a lot of my art. In
Yeah.
fact, that's all mostly me there.
Yeah.
And that's where the models came in handy,
Right.
because we had a Russian MiG right there, even had the instructions so I could see what it looked like on the inside.
Yeah, crazy. This is crazy work, man. This is just so, like, it still is fantastic now, and
Well, thank you.
It's hard to come up with things that hold up like that. I think, you understand why Fantagraphics led with this story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, you put in labor and it shows.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always pay off. It has to be thoughtful labor.
Yeah.
It's really easy to fill pages up with ink lines
Right.
and come up with nothing.
Right.
And a whole lot of comic product is like that.
It's true.
Well,
you're talking about product too, right?
Right.
It's product
And
first.
and I don't have a problem with that, because there's an audience for that, and it fills what they're after. A variety. So I don't expect our readers to be big Wolverine fans, for instance. But you never know. But they can read both titles.
Yeah, exactly. Some people read. It was always a thing that I said to people that, like, back in the day, everybody who read Love and Rockets, every single one of them also read at least one superhero comic. It's just how it works, man. People like the form, they like the medium. Any other questions please?
When you think back over all of the years that you've collaborated with Gilbert, how did that evolve, from when you started to kind of how you are now?
Well, I don't go to Europe as much as I used to. And the publisher doesn't pay for it. But on the other hand, it kind of evolved along with the way the strip was done. I don't know what it would be like if Gilbert hadn't moved to Europe. Who knows? If Gilbert hadn't decided to switch gears, I might still be going over there and working on the thing. But at some point in the 90s, he switched gears to Not Quite Dead. And right at the point, we started working with a German cartoonist friend of ours, a famous cartoonist and creator in its own right in Germany, a fellow named Gerhard Seifried, who I had made friends with back in the 70s. He'd basically, at that time, called the Robert Crumb of Germany. even though no American had ever heard of him back then. But anyway, I went over to Europe on my own dime and spent 2 or 3 months there with Gerhard and Gilbert, traveling around Europe like the Freak Brothers, working on a storyline for another 100-page story called Planet of the Cops. And we got the whole story blocked out, had a pile of sketches like this, and even started working a bunch of pages, and Gilbert suddenly killed the project and said it was too political and unrealistic. And that was that. And
Right.
we, okay. And the odd part is that in the ensuing time that Gilbert did that back in the early 90s, almost everything in that story has come true.
Isn't that always the way, though?
It was
Isn't
this
that always-
elaborately worked out plot where the Freak Brothers were chased all over Europe by a prescient version of Homeland Security for being the greatest scofflaws in America. And they end up being put on trial for their lives after being finally captured. And except the jury is America. It's like the internet before the internet, and everybody gets to vote on whether they're guilty or not. And but at the very last second, when it looks like they're going to be convicted and executed, Phineas breaks down into some long hysterical plea for legalizing hemp, which somehow convinces everyone that they can solve all the world's problems by legalizing hemp. So instead of being executed, they're hailed as heroes, and hemp is planted everywhere. But just as the crops are about to be harvested, all the hippies break down the fences and smoke all the hemp, and the economy crashes, and everyone loses their jobs, and the Freak Brothers end up having to hide in Serbia somewhere. Yeah, see, Gerhard and I thought it was good.
Yeah.
Planet of the Cops.
And where is that artwork?
Gilbert has some of it. I have a little bit. Gerhard might have a little bit. I have some story notes. And just like in the Idiots Abroad, we spent what I thought was way too much time in French model shops. And Gilbert even went out and bought a French barge model, a canal barge, because we decided Freak Brothers were going to live on it. So he bought this model, this big, that had to be assembled. Like it was wood pieces, not plastic. An actual old style boat model where you have to sit there and thread. Use thread, and I'm not sure if Gilbert ever built it. He might have, but. I think it would have been good, but who knows?
It's almost inconceivable to me that there's a story out there that's a 100-page story that was well into production that isn't anymore.
Well, I had another graphic novel that was slated for production that got killed off by my sales tax case in the 90s.
Yeah.
That I co-wrote with film director and friend Alex Cox and his one of the actors he worked with, a fellow named Dick Rude, who was in Repo Man.
Yeah.
And it was called 1963 and a Half, and it was a science fiction story about the Kennedy assassination and alien invasion.
Yeah.
And was going to be an eight book 200-page graphic novel.
Okay.
And going in, the numbers were all great. we were all going to make good money. We made good money writing the story, had a contract, and then I couldn't work on it for a number of years. And all the economics of comic field shifted, and by then it was like, I can't, at the speed I work, this can't make money.
Yeah.
You know, I'll starve to death working on it. So that project got canned. And in the ensuing time, almost every one of our jokes and concepts had been arrived at by other people along the way.
Right.
We just happened to think, you know, the way our minds work, we arrived on these weird points first.
Yeah.
But, you know, once they start showing up in other people's work, and they didn't take them from us.
Yeah,
You know,
sure,
there,
I
there weren't
understand.
the scripts floating around or
Yeah.
anything.
I understand.
They just, you know, oh yeah, let's do that. And it's like, you know, oh, so instead of inventing peanut butter and jelly, this got the opportunity. What can you do?
Yeah.
And now I'm not so sure some of the stuff would work as well because of other things that have shifted in the culture.
Right.
Politically and socially. So, you know, it probably would have been well received back then.
Yeah.
But not reprinted 30 years later like this.
Yeah. Wow, 2 major projects that
Yeah.
Wow. Huh. Okay. Well, you want to?
You had a question.
Sure. I was just going to ask about, without spoiling the end, it ends with a very...
It's 33 years old. We can spoil the end at this point.
Over the north.
Rosebud was a sled.
That punchline, was that thought about in the beginning? Like, they're never going to make it to where they were originally planning to go? Or was that part of the original idea? Or was that...
Could you explain that again?
They never make it to Colombia, right?
No.
That was my idea. My question has to do with if that was the original idea, that they would try to set on embark on this adventure somewhere and they would never make it. Base it around the...
Well, they did kind of end up back in South America at that volcano that blows up. But certainly not by any route that getting on a plane to Colombia, an old Connie private airline.
If I can, I think what he's asking is the last joke is Norbert.
Oh, right.
Norbert's still there, which was set up like 40 pages before.
That's exactly right. The fool is still waiting for them to bust them.
Yeah. So even though the whole rest of the story hadn't been written, was that part always kind of nice.
I mean, I had writing jokes about Norbert the Narc is fun because who doesn't like to torture a cop like that? or have him, more to the point, have him torture himself.
Yeah. Did you have a follow-up? Yeah, very good. I want to ask you about the case with the Board of Equalization and sort of how that came about, what their thinking was with that.
There was a scene in Terry Gilliam's Brazil where a fly falls into a printer that's printing out a arrest order for a guy named Tuttle, and instead the fly falls into the printer and a bee is printed, and a man named Buttle is arrested and killed instead. And that's how I got sort of caught up with the Board of Equalization in California. Was the state agency, the former state agency in charge of collecting sales tax and use tax on business transactions, or allowing them to be used as deductions or not taxed, as it were. And I filed taxes with them, because returns with them, because I sell artwork and this and that. But I had never collected royalty sales tax on my royalties, which are earned through intellectual authors' rights, intangible and untaxable. They're taxed as income, but they're not a sales tax transaction because they're considered intangible, your ideas. And so I reported my royalty income for Comix that year, which I was fairly low, $1,400. And they came back with an audit and said, no, you actually owe us taxes on $94,000 of income. And I went, say what? And their computer had replaced a 1 with a 9. So that made it enough money for them to suddenly get excited about this. They could get some money out of me. And I said, well, okay, no, here's what I filed. You can see it's your mistake. I only made $1,400 and I owe nothing on it because it's intellectual property. And they said, no, it's not. And I went, what? I said, well, we did make the mistake about the large amount, but this isn't intellectual property because all you do is prepare templates for printing manufacturing. I went, huh?
That's insane. That's an insane statement for them to make.
But it's one they've tried in other areas, as I quickly learned. They tried the same thing with the music industry back in 1968 on Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, and said, when you give your master recording tape, we want all the money that you earned on royalties because you transferred real property to the manufacturer that contains, it's a template for manufacturing records in that instance. The board can separate things out by categories so that they don't have to be consistent with the one next to it that's exactly like it. So they experimented on music and that went nowhere, so they trotted it back out on Comix and said, you're not really an author. You're just making these patterns. The guy who writes the words is the author, and you're not really an author then, even if you write the words, because you drew the pictures too. And I said, the hell with you, I'm not paying this. It's unconstitutional. And we were off to the races because beyond me, which would have been a test case, they were planning on attacking everybody that moved anything related to comics through California in one direction or another, so that literally every newspaper comic, every cartoon in a magazine that was printed or sold in California, all the newspaper comics, all the animated cartoons on TV, they thought they were going to grab $3 to $8 billion in new money, and they all got bounties, personal bounties, a portion of that as a reward. So I had to fight with them for 5 years in a regulatory dispute. It never even was a trial or anything. We were just fighting over the regulation and whether it applied for 5 years.
Yeah.
And
the ACLU, the CBLDF, worked on the defense. Did they fund it all, or like how badly did you have to go out of pocket to?
I lost my life savings to that point, spending my own money on, staying alive because I wasn't able to work while I was dealing with this. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund got a heavy discount on one of the top sales tax firms in the state that they hired for me. That set them back at least $75,000 at the time, a real chunk of change. And the ACLU stepped in late in the game and said, if this goes to court, we're pledging $5 million for Mavrides' move up the federal court system. Their attitude, my opponent's attitudes shifted seriously when I walked in with my first set of lawyers that the defense fund gave me, because his suit cost more than everybody's income in the room. And they had my tax return. They knew I could not pay for the guy sitting next to me, which meant I was juiced. And they suddenly took me seriously. Because it meant I had friends that could pay for these things. Yeah. And along the way, I picked up two more corporate law firms, top shelf outfits. One paid by an anonymous donor from LA, who I suspect is a famous TV production person or company, and another one paid for by the Creator Syndicate, which was also facing an audit and a challenge for their own syndication from the BOE. So they were behind me in line. Yeah. So they were like shoring me up, since I was going to have to fall before they could get. If I didn't fall, they're free. So I ended up with a legal team that when we had a phone meeting, I wasn't allowed to say hello or ask them how they were, because somebody ran the numbers and said to say hello to each other would cost your defense fund $3,000. So we're just going to get right to it. And in the end, what won the case was not all this legal power, which would have come in handy in a courtroom, but me just going crazy and working on drumming up a PR campaign to paint the board as the enemies of mankind and all that's good and proper. And had the help of the media, too, at some point, when they began picking up on the case of it. The laugh tags, meet the man that wants to kill Snoopy. You know, and these guys all ran for office. They were elected because nobody knew what they did or who they were. So they just got ticked off. They almost never had opponents in their campaigns. And all of a sudden, cartoonists were like doing editorial cartoons, making fun of them and drawing their faces and doing TV stories about them. And they knew their careers were just going to go in the toilet if they didn't back off. So at my final appeal, they folded, and the head lawyer for the state, a guy with hair longer than Freewheelin' Franklin's, who had come after me viciously, in one split second, once they made that ruling, he was now like arguing like in favor of all my concepts and how I was a brilliant person. And then the weirdest part of all was the staffs of the people who were trying to do this scheme all came up to me with Freak Brother comics for me to autograph. Yeah, sure.
No reason not to be gracious.
Except for the one guy who said, Mavrides is little better than a pornographer. Well, he was the only no vote, so, you know. I mean, one of the things I did was I left them a door open. You know, I said, look, you know, and without saying it directly, look, I painted you into a corner. You guys can't escape from this. And I'm going to destroy you because I don't have a job anymore. You've made it so that my only purpose in life is to bring you down to my level. Or you can go through this door I cut in the wall that's marked Hero of the Day, because I don't even care about being a hero. You can be the hero. Just agree with me, and all this will go away. And then I worked with the Graphic Artists Guild in the AFL-CIO after we got the case won to put it into regulations. Yeah. So they couldn't test this out on anybody else in publishing. To seal it, you know, okay, here's it. stated so there's no room for interpretation.
Yeah.
So we took care of that just in time for the internet to show up and get rid of all of that, because now nothing was tangibly transmitted or transferred.
Right.
Everything became digital,
Right.
and there's no sales tax on.
But you couldn't have known that. I mean,
No,
you fought a fight that
it had to be
fight.
done.
Yeah.
And besides, I was stapled to the firing squad wall.
Yeah.
So,
So I you're kind of cynical about civilization sometimes. I see.
growing up in Akron will do that.
Yeah, no, sure, no, completely fucking understandable. But I wonder if the fact that justice actually won, like, ease that cynicism at all.
Well, a little bit, and it depends how you edit it, like the New York Times did with their follow-up on the case, where I proclaimed to them, "The system works!" Exclamation point. As long as you're backed by powerful law firms paid for by rich people. They left that part of the quote off.
Right.
So I had people going, "Well, you certainly turned into a Pollyanna about the system." And I went, "Well, not really." But, I mean, it's true. The government is constrained in many cases to give you enough rope to hang yourself, if that's what you want. But they also give you steps to, argue against that. And circumstances and the players are what determines how much of that is according to the way things are supposed to be and how they actually are more often than not, which is not according to how it's supposed to go. And the reasons for that are as varied as the number of people there are. So, but in this case, it worked. I mean, I was lucky that the comics industry had as much bank as it did at the time the case started. Because in the time my case unfolded, it went from a $3 billion a year industry to Marvel Comics collapsing.
Right.
And in fact, I was trying to get a letter of support. I right at the very end, I was still racking up support from different groups and people to use in a court fight. So I had like a sheath of letters and things from all kinds of people, like from Ray Bradbury, from children's library associations, from to pull out should I need it. And now I forgot where I was going with this. Well, I called Marvel Comics for one, and for a month, the person I talked to the day before had been laid off or fired, and I was speaking to a new person every single day until I got to the head of Marvel, who was the only. He even got rid of his secretary at that point. It was sitting in the empty office by himself. That was, I forget his name, but he managed to pawn the company off on somebody that re-energized it. But, it was kind of like weird. You think, oh, Marvel, the bullpen, this and that, it's like, what? I had this image of this, like an office floor after the .com boom blew out. It's like all this furniture with nobody sitting in it. And the phones removed, and so that was going on. So if the timing had been different, the defense fund wouldn't have been there, or rich cartoonist A wouldn't have stepped in, or this or that. Because we weren't fighting over that much money, like about $900 in
Sure.
all.
But the downward effect that ruling
Right.
had
Well,
on
they would
every
have
cartoonist in
they would have
California.
turned around and just started hammering people, starting with the people that I did business with.
Yeah.
And one of those would have been Image Comics,
Yeah.
who got suddenly panicked when
Yep.
I pointed out after they had said, "We're too busy making money." And I went, "Well, that's good, because you're going to need it to pay your taxes once I lose."
Yep.
And they went, "What do you mean? You don't." I said, "I worked for you. I did a page in Spawn." Stuff people send into space.
Yeah.
And that's like millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Okay, here's your letter.
Yep. I gotta say, I think you're a goddamn hero. I mean, I really do. Man. I really do.
I was lucky, like I said, a lot of factors. I if it had been in somebody else, because the solutions were easy to pass it on to somebody else, pay the small bill, and let the next person take it in the face. Or worse yet, self-published people. It would have wiped out anybody self-publishing. But the real part that I really objected to, and this is where the ACLU came in and the First Amendment aspects, were that the sales tax board is basically setting up their license, which is required by anyone collecting or sales tax on their behalf, to become an author's license.
Yeah.
And the board could take it away from you. And suddenly you wouldn't, and if you lost that license, you wouldn't be able to sell your work and make a living from it. Clearly unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court has ruled several times in the past in other cases precisely that point. And the board was just, we don't have to listen to that. In a court, you do. Which is why they didn't want me to go near a courtroom. Because another case coming up right behind mine did get into the federal courtroom, and the federal judge just reamed them a new one. So they lucked out. And then they became so incompetent and so hated that the state just destroyed them and rebooted the whole thing and moved the power to do all this stuff to some other group that wasn't as random. Because they evolved. I mean, the case right before my final hearing was an argument about whether they should have sales tax on emu meat, and if that would discourage the growing emu industry,
Right.
which you've noticed everybody's eating emu meat now.
Well,
It did make me go buy some. I didn't care for it.
All right, so let's start to wrap this up. I got sort of two more questions. My final two questions are like my first question. They're the same for every interview. The first one is are you working on anything? Is there anything that you can plug, that you want to plug, that we can see your work again? Are you retired at this point? What's your dealio, buddy?
Oh, well, I'm a low-income artist who's slowly doing gallery art
Yeah.
and uh, slowly putting together an art book for Fantagraphics
Okay.
and whatever other projects might kick into my path.
Yeah. With no specific comics stuff.
No, I don't see. I mean, what gets printed now? I mean, nothing in the comic book form in the alternative.
Yeah.
Like and even if it was, there's no focused audience to consume it.
Right.
And I work so slowly by myself that doing a graphic novel would just be a suicidal slog.
Yeah.
I'm 70 years old,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Uh, so paintings and
Yeah.
conceptual art
Yeah.
and
Understandable.
this and that.
I was just sort of hoping that you might have had something that you've been tinkering with.
No.
You know,
Big reveal. Oh, well, this is a good time to announce my
That's what I was hoping for.
My-
You know.
plan to dominate the planet and bend every creature to my will through that one.
That's what I'm trying to say. We'd be down with that. All right. Well, so and then the last question is we do have a lot of people who because you're somewhere in our 250th interview, somewhere like that. So we have a lot of people who watch this who want to be cartoonists themselves. And the thing I hear all the time from wannabe cartoonists is, how do I start? What do I do? How do I make comics? So if some young person came up to you and said, "Mr. Mavrides, sir, how do I make comics?" What would you say? What would pop into your head?
Get your parents to throw you out of the house. Barring that, pay attention to them. Expand your horizons beyond comics so that they inform your comics. Read comics. Look at them. Think about them. The routes to actually getting published are a bit different than like. All right, my first comic. Jay Kinney and I were doing this single panel conspiracy cartoons for underground newspapers and alternative press. One panel, one little conspiracy, one joke.
Yeah.
After we did a few for the Berkeley Barb and the Realist, we thought, well, maybe we could get into Ripoff Syndicate, get paid to do these things and then collect them into a comic book. And I thought, great. And this is how I met Gilbert. Jake Kinney and I went down to Ripoff Press, got our pitch practiced. I brought every piece of paper I had ever scribbled on in my entire life in this 300-pound portfolio and went up to see Gilbert Shelton. And Gilbert was, I was in awe, and he was casually playing pool and smoking a joint and drinking a beer while we were talking to him. Jay and I, give him our pitch, and he goes, "Okay." And I went, "What?" And he goes, "We'll print it." And you're like, "Okay, we'll get the contract, and that's it." And he went back to playing pool, and Jay and I left. And before that, I said, "Don't you want to look at my art?" Nah. If Jay says you can draw, you can draw. And I kind of went out feeling elated and depressed at the same time. It's like that was too easy. But that's all it took in my case. Of course, I spent thousands of hours doodling and drawing and all the things that go into that. memorizing all those comic books that my parents burned,
Yeah.
so that even though they burned them, they were still here.
Oh, I love it, man. I love it. I love it. I love this book. I really do. I'm so glad that you were able to come.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, of course, man. Of course. I don't know. As I said, this holds up. There's not very much stuff from 33 years ago that really holds up, I gotta say. You know, it's weird. There's stuff from like 60 years ago that holds up, you know, but not so much stuff from like 30, 40 years ago. Like,
can't always predict it.
Doesn't age right, you know? And this does. I don't know.
Well, read the Freak Brothers story, the Freak Brothers in the 21st century. A lot of it's uncomfortably came true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But coming true isn't the same thing as holding up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure. That's for sure. So yes, no, thank you for making this. And really, this is, as I said at the beginning of this to me is kind of the definition of a comics masterpiece. If you're sitting and watching at home, you know.
Praise Gilbert too.
Praise Gilbert too, yeah. And, you know, if you were to buy a copy from us, maybe Ben will put the web store up at the bottom of the screen. Every copy that we have also comes with a signed book plate by both Gilbert and Paul, which is kind of amazing, actually. You know, these are from France, so yeah.
Oh la la!
You know, so that's pretty cool. A little bit of other business. I just want to mention that you know, we have two other clubs. One is the Kids Club, and that meeting is happening on Sunday for the book Squire. Sarah Alphagim and Nadia Shamas are the creators. It's Sarah who's here, right? Sarah is going to be here in person, and Nadia will be on a video call. So that'll be this Sunday morning. And then next Wednesday is the regular, it's the new book Adult Club. And the book is Nice House on the Lake. And author James Tinian, who is pretty much the hottest writer today in mainstream comics, because he was writing Batman and a bunch of other stuff. And this is a really spectacular book. So that'll be next Wednesday. I hope that you guys can come back and make them, and I hope everybody at home gets to watch this. I want to thank Ben for running the show. I want to thank Jordan for being a producer and doing a bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff. I want to thank Kat and Katie and Zoe, my staff, for being so goddamn good at their jobs that I'm allowed to sit around and yeah, exactly. I can waste time talking to cartoonists because they do all the hard work. And I want to thank all the members of the club, because if we didn't have you as members, we couldn't possibly do this. In fact, we couldn't still be a comic book store probably anymore, not in an expensive city like San Francisco. So it really makes a huge difference to us. And I want to thank you, Paul, and I want to thank all creators for making comics, because we wouldn't have a store without you. And so
you really wouldn't have it without the readers.
And the readers as well, yes. Yes, but the dreamers, you have to dream the dream.
Well, yes, everyone is required to do their part.
Exactly. Comics, yeah. Right, okay. Yes, give that a round.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all very much. We'll see you again Sunday morning. Take care. Thanks very much for watching this episode of the Classic Graphic Novel of the Month Club. If you enjoyed this interview, please make sure you hit subscribe and hit that bell up in the top corner. You know, every month we look at the history of comics and we pick a great graphic novel to bring you and a great interview to bring you as well. We'd love it if you joined the club, and we hope that you can join us.